Fate, Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 41-42. Chapter 41. Map Markers. Sullivan and Da Vinci Pav. I'm not sure whether I should congratulate you that your interrogation techniques were so painful that our captive would rather speed up their own death to avoid them, or mock you for allowing them to die. Sullivan spoke up, not looking away from his desk as he continued to work on something. Now. Da Vinci sang through the screen next to him. No need to be rude, besides, it's not like we had much time to get information from him anyway. No, I suppose not. Castor shrugged his shoulders, then held a small decorated ring over the map as he began chanting in a strange language. The map in front of him began to glow, lines forming through across the entire region. Lowering his hand, he stared at the map. Impressive, I had thought you know more than mere bluster, but your boasting is matched by your competence. Well, I am a genius after all. You seem remarkably uncaring of my, debatably colored, past. Sullivan pointed out, looking towards the screen, although I suspect it is an opinion formed from necessity rather than anything else. Oh, you are an unrepentant mass murderer. Da Vinci bluntly put, but I can't deny intelligence when I see it. How quaint. He looked back to the map. In any event, it has confirmed our hypothesis. He gestured towards the map, running a wooden finger along the image of the ley lines. Aldrich was draining the ley lines along the entire western region. Indeed. Da Vinci nodded her head. However, it appears that he stopped just shy of Spain. The far most western country. Indeed. However, even with our combined efforts, mapping the ley lines of an entire continent is difficult. He replied, but from this, we may begin to discover the location he is present within. They do not appear to be registering further drainage to them. Perhaps this ley line was important enough to provide the extra fuel he needed. The extravagant Castor mused, cupping her chin with a thoughtful expression. He may require more magical energy than he has at present to open the rift to this abyss. Possible. Sullivan nodded. This era seems to be lacking in sufficient mana within the air. A side effect of the lack of lords. If you refer to the Age of Gods, then that has been in decline for some time now, but it picked up with the death of Solomon 900 years ago. Well, 900 years from where you are now, for us it's more like 3,000. Sullivan stared at her image for a few moments before turning his head back to the map. I envy your people, that you could so easily detach yourselves from the gods. Letting out a tired sigh, he went on. No matter, we will continue on as planned. The contraption you sent here, it has begun sending back information. Indeed. Da Vinci grinned, all sorts of wonderful little numbers. It's refreshing to speak with someone who actually understands half of what I'm saying. A shame you're morally bankrupt. From my perspective, I see no true error with my actions. He shrugged. The Age of Fire had crippled the world for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. When the future of the world is in jeopardy, is there any price that could be too high? There's a whole can of worms I could crack open right there about means and ends. Means and ends. Sullivan tilted his head. Is that a saying? The ends justify the means. Sullivan's wooden brows rose, producing a slight creaking sound as they did. That is a surprisingly accurate saying. Still, I suspect you do not share it. I'm all for showing off genius and saving the world, but that does not excuse excessive murder and mutilation experiments. Da Vinci frowned. Ash informed us in greater detail when he warned us about you. Ah, told you about the sewers, I suppose. Sullivan let out a small chuckle when she nodded her head. Irithil was just as much a mockery of how I perceived what the lords had done to the world as it was defense against wayward undead. He shrugged. It did not work in the end, but that does not detract from it. Did I derive minor amusement from experimenting on those citizens? Yes. Although considering they were religious fanatics who would desperately cling to such a perverse way of life, is it really a sin to make their looks match their beliefs? Da Vinci's face scrunched up. Like I said, a whole can of worms I refuse to open. You clearly believe what you have done is right, while I believe what you have done is wrong. At the end of the day, there is nothing much that can be said. True enough, was Sullivan's uncaring reply, moving back to the table before he froze for a few moments in thought. However, when you find yourself staring towards the precipice, finding your vision glued onto what you see as the end of life, you find that it becomes remarkably easier to engage in acts you would have once found repulsive. Your claim to moral supremacy may sound enticing now, but I have no doubts you will abandon it when the situation calls for it. Turning his head to stare at the silent inventor, my actions were necessary, and I admit I found enjoyment in the experimentations I performed, but they all served a purpose. I needed Orithil guarded from incursions, thus I created the Outrider Knights. I needed someone to put an end to the lords in Anor Londo, thus I allowed the Church of the Deep and Aldrich entry into the valley. He stood back up to his full height, turning his whole body to face the caster. I did all this, because it truly was for the betterment of the world. If all it takes to end the stagnation of life is for me to sacrifice my morals, then that is a small price to pay. If it is progression born out of cruelty, then the world will know nothing but the cruelty of progression. Da Vinci replied, you would have brought about a cycle which viewed innovation as a partner of ruthlessness. Can you truly say such a world is worth it? We will never know. Sullivan shrugged his shoulders, but for me, even if it was a world perpetuated by despicable acts, as long as it continued to stride forwards, as time continued in a linear fashion, then that would have been enough for me. Tilting his head, he sighed, you are not quite there yet. Your world progresses onwards, even in this corruption of history, the world still marches forwards. But we shall see who is right by the end of it. A bet over the abandonment of morals. Da Vinci shook her head, giving a wry smirk. That's one I'd rather not gamble on. We'll see. Sullivan replied, turning back to his desk. On a more relevant topic, how far have you gotten in tracking down Aldrich? We're close. Da Vinci replied, using the ley lines, we'll be able to identify points of disturbances. Hopefully the largest will belong to Aldrich and be the center of this singularity. Hopefully, Sullivan replied in a quiet voice, hope is something which I do not rely upon often. You should, it's actually quite nice. HMPH. Ritska, Mash and Lucian Pav. I don't know what a Victorian is. Lucian replied with a shrug of his shoulders, furrowing his brows under his hat, nor how it relates to me. Ritska stared at him with slightly narrowed eyes, then crossed his arms. Where did you say you were from again? Yarnum. I've never heard of that. He turned to Mash. The girl offered a slight shrug in response, showing that she wasn't sure either. What about you, Roman? We've got nothing in our records about any place called Yarnum. Romani replied, an interested tone in his voice. Perhaps he's from a different world. I am. Lucian answered immediately. I know that much. He looked up at the sky, towards the moon, mainly because of that. The moon. Romani blinked. Why? Is it different? No. Yes. Lucian offered a confused reply. It feels different. Sighing, he looked back to the group in front of him. Regardless, I am from a different world to you. Huh. Romani shrugged. I probably shouldn't be surprised that more visitors from Ash's world. I'm not from his world either. What? The doctor squeaked in shock. How? Does this mean we have a second world involved in this now? How many more can we expect? Was there a need to shout? Well, Ritska scratched the back of his neck. Traveling between worlds is apparently a bit harder for us. It is. Lucian-san. Don't tell me. Mash sounded almost hesitant as she tried to ask the question. Do you travel between worlds too? You don't. I don't think we should tell the director about this particular part. Romani spoke up. Ritska and Mash turned to see the doctor's strained expression. She got pretty hysterical when she found out that Ash's world could use the second magic like that. If she finds out another world is doing it, she might burst a blood vessel. Probably. Ritska nodded his head sagely. She did look pretty madhum. Ah. He grinned, leaning down to pick something up near his legs. There you are, Fu. I was wondering where you got to. He smiled as he pet the small animal behind the ears. You like to wander off, don't you? Fu. The small animal replied. Mash giggled and then widened her eyes in realization. Ah, that's right, Lucian-san. She turned back to the hunter. This is Fo-eh. Is something wrong? Ritsuka turned to see what Mash was talking about, promptly blinking in surprise at the display. Lucian's eyes were locked onto the small white animal. They were white and frightful with visible sweat trailing down his forehead. His hands were trembling as he stared at the animal, nervously swallowing. What? What is that? He spoke out, voice awash with fear. Ritsuka and Mash blinked, looking to each other in confusion and then back to the hunter. Ritsuka held him out in front of him. This is Fu. BL bloody hell, Lucian stuttered, backing away from them. You two are fucking crazier than me. Ritsuka and Mash stared at each other, not entirely sure what they were supposed to make of that sentence. The hunter continued to stare at Fu as if it were the most horrific thing they had laid eyes on. Fu stared at the hunter, tilting its head to the side. Q. Then let out a tiny bark that had the man flinch. Servant's pav. 'Twas after Milord had placed down the ashes of the Lothric princes. Cecilia recounted with a small smile. Gareth and Arash sitting near her with eager eyes as she continued her story. He proclaimed that the long journey was nearly over. Unfortunately, Milord forgot his feet. No, Arash grinned. He didn't. Cecilia nodded. Milord forgot that the Lothric throne was the highest point of the shrine interior. He turned to leave, then slipped and fell from it. PFF'd. Gareth covered her mouth to stop the laugh from spilling out. He fell off the throne. Indeed. Onto his head. She let out a slight giggle. Unfortunately, the fall did kill him. When he returned, he remained silent for a good while. 'Twas quite amusing. I believe he sulked for some time. I'm amazed you can make a story about some poor guy falling on his head and breaking his neck on the verge of completing his quest so amusing. Arash commented, shaking his head with a wry grin on his face. Must be a special thing about being undead that makes that type of thing amusing. Ah, Cecilia froze, her mouth forming an O shape in realization. Her shoulders slumped slightly as she looked away. Apologize, perhaps I have spoilt the mood. Nonsense. Gareth proclaimed with a grin. That's the type of silly thing that people normally hear about. She quickly paused, a frown soon appearing on her face. Then again, they don't typically die, but he comes back alive, so it's all good. I guess. An interested hum brought their attention to Solaire as the knight made his way over to the group. What's all this talk then? It looks very interesting. Sharing amusing stories. Arash supplied with a smile. Although right now we're trying to find out if undead humor is different, considering most of Cecilia's end up with someone dying. Ah. Solaire nodded his head, crossing his arms. Yes, that is certainly true. Although dying is such a common thing that it has since lost meaning to undead. Going hollow, however, that is very different. Regardless. Solaire waved his hand, dismissing the thought and sitting near the group, removing his helmet and giving them a wry smile. I suppose I should tell you the story of how I first met one of my good friends in Lordran, Bedrick. Oh. Arash leaned forwards. Sounds like this will be good. Oh, yes. Solaire chuckled. We first met in Undead Burg. Near enough the bridge. He was quite relieved to meet another who was of sound mind. Well. Another laugh escaped his lips, this one more embarrassed, as sound mind as one could be in Lordran. I had journeyed there after becoming undead myself, anyway. He was in such a rush to get across the bridge that he didn't give me enough chance to warn him. Warn him about what? Gareth asked, tilting her head. Solaire smiled. The large wyvern currently roosting there. Gareth and Arash widened their eyes, the former gaped in shock. A wyvern. How big? Oh. Covered half the bridge with its body at least. Solaire cupped his chin in thought. Anyway, he rushes off before I can warn him, but I figured he would be back soon anyway. Giving a shrug, Then Knight let out a small huff of mirth. Sure enough, I hear the roar of the wyvern and the sound of the inferno it breathes out. Then there's silence for a few moments. He paused for effect, the others leaning in towards him, then Bedrick comes back where he came the first time. Staring at me with the most gobsmacked expression I had ever seen. When he asked if I knew about the wyvern, I told him that he ran off before I could mention it. Arash and Gareth shook their heads in equal parts exasperation. Wyverns sound an awful lot bigger than what I would have thought. I thought wyverns were supposed to be smaller than dragons. Gareth wondered with a small frown. At least that's how they described them in the previous singularity. Solaire tilted his head, nodding slowly. There were several differing breed of wyverns. They were all offshoots of the everlasting dragons. The drakes were the smallest, I believe. They were a little smaller than Sif, I would say. He shrugged. However, they were more numerous and often spat lightning instead. Lightning, huh? Arash nodded. Sounds a little different to what I was expecting, but Fafnir was apparently a dragon that spewed poison. Ah, Bedrick mentioned a dragon like that once. Solaire offered, although he said it had succumbed to the undead curse. A nasty fate. I thought it was just humans that could get that. Gareth asked, frowning in confusion as she did. Well, humans were the most susceptible to it. The knight affirmed, it was quite rare for other races to contract such a curse, not impossible but exceedingly uncommon. Sounds nasty. It was simply the way life was. The knight shrugged. Besides, that is not the only story I have of good Bedrick and dragons. Really? Oh, yes. There was one dragon that turned its stomach into a mouth. It did what? Gareth cried out in shock. Ash and Olga Pav. You're looking somewhat tense. Olga looked away from the table she was sat at, turning towards the voice and relaxing slightly as Ash made his way towards her. Does something trouble you? No. She replied instantly, wincing at how unconvincing she sounded to herself. Ash grunted in acknowledgement. I thought you would be with your firekeeper, was it? Cecilia is experiencing proper socialization for the first time in. Ash paused. A long time, I suppose. I can allow her that. I had thought you would be in the company of the Emperor, considering her interest in you. Olga let out a groan, her forehead slamming onto the table. Please don't joke about that. She's been trying to seduce me for several days already. Ash chuckled, sitting opposite her. You should be honored, being the object of interest for such an important figure. Olga's head raised, glaring at the saber servant. He shook his head, removing his helmet and placing it on the table and giving her a calm expression. I joke. Although she does seem quite enamored with you. She also seemed quite enamored with your firekeeper. Olga shot back, smirking as Ash's face flattened out. Should you not be honored that your close friend was the object of interest for such an important person? Ash rolled his eyes, crossing his arms and leaning back into his chair. It seems you have regained some of your good humor. You have appeared quite stressed for some time now. I'm fine. She snapped back. I don't need pity. It was not pity I offered. The saber shook his head, rubbing his brows. What can you tell me of this, Lev? Olga glared at him. Why? His betrayal has troubled many, none more so than you. Ash explained. I can only assume he meant a great deal to you. It doesn't matter anymore. She replied in a dead tone of voice. Lev has sabotaged Chaldea and put all of human history at risk. He needs to be stopped. Lady Olga, you are crying. Her hand snapped up to her eyes in an instant, wiping them down and composing herself. You must be mistaken. I wouldn't do something so childish as to. I see. Ash replied in a quiet tone of voice. Lady Olga. You have done an admirable job thus far. She guffawed at him. Is that supposed to be some sort of joke? I've been harassed since I got here, and absolutely nothing has gone right. What were you expecting to happen? What was I? She growled. I was expecting competence. Chaldea was supposed to be the culmination of my father's dream. We would work to preserve the human foundation. I was. She cut herself off, looking away from him. It doesn't matter. My social skills are limited. Ash replied to her with a skeptical tone, however, I can tell that you are attempting to bury your concerns. I'm the director of Chaldea. She scoffed back. I am to appear dignified at all times and present a strong foundation for the entire facility. Weakness would undermine my position. Coughing into her hand, besides. I must be composed for when we capture Lev Lanor and determine his motives. She trailed off, looking at Ash and biting her lip nervously. You said he was a demon. I did. He replied with a nod. And he is. Not like the Chaos Witch, but there is the same feeling surrounding him. Do you think it's possession? I was unaware demons could do such things. Ash replied with a shrug, but if they are capable of such feats in your world, it is entirely possible he is not acting of his own will. Olga looked visibly relieved. Then there's a chance. I said it was possible. Ash cut her off, staring at her with a frown. And what will you do if he was a demon the entire time you knew him? That's. She looked far more anxious now, rubbing her upper arms and hunching herself in, that is. But that. I would not abandon hope just yet. Ash attempted to reassure her, however, I'd advise you be prepared for the worst outcome. Worst outcome? She scoffed incredulously, how can it be worse than our current situation? I have found that it can always get worse. He replied in a deadly serious tone, however bad you believe the situation to be, it is best not to tempt fate further. Experience. Yes. She let out a mirthless snort in response. It seems you've taken some of that experience with you, with how this singularity has gone so far. You have secured the aid of a lord, a chaos witch, a giant, an emperor and their empire. Ash flatly replied with a raised eyebrow, you have more help than I ever received, you should take greater pride in that achievement. Olga sat in her seat, quietly brewing back a response before her eyes flicked back to the unkindled. I suppose we did, didn't we? She gave a tiny smile. In spite of everything, it has gone pretty well so far. It has. Ash nodded his head in affirmation, letting out small sigh, certainly far more than one would have expected, given the nature of our foe and the scope of our allies. A scowl came to his face, however. Sullivan can be trusted to fulfill his role. That much is certain, beyond that I do not know. Well, the god wants to kill him when this is completed. Olga shrugged, you probably won't have to deal with him for long. HMPH. Ash nodded in response, I imagine he probably would. He suddenly paused, feeling a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. Olga's eyes looked just past him, trailing upwards. Ash turned around, finding himself staring at an armored knee. His eyes began to look upwards, further up as he took in the figure standing behind him. The Dragon Slayer armor glared down at him, craning itself over so its shadow fell over his entirety. Ash turned back around. Olga raised an eyebrow then looked up at her servant. It's fine Berserker, Saber is an ally. The armor released a growl in response. What's the matter with you? She frowned. Barely a peep so far and then all of sudden you're growling. She mumbled under her breath, somewhat confused. Well, Ash coughed into his hand, looking away, that might be, my fault. Olga raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? The armor growled again, her eyes flicked back the two of them. Well, I'm not sure if you could use the term, kill, with a suit of armor but, the armor released a deeper groan, sounding somewhat disapproving. Olga's face flattened out in realization. How many other heroic spirits can we expect to encounter that you have killed? I'm not entirely certain. Ash rubbed the back of his neck. It's entirely possible that we would encounter many more who I have personally slain. However, with the concept of the throne stretching across every age of fire, it is more likely we will encounter individuals who I have no knowledge of. HMPH. She grunted in acknowledgement. Frowning, the Holy Grail usually grants the servants access to all the history of the world necessary for the time period they are summoned in. Tilting her head, she cupped her chin and looked at Ash more inquisitively. How is it you are not only ignorant of the history of this world, but also of the history of your own world? I would not know. My knowledge of summoning is limited, and even then, it is the system of summoning of my world. Ash shrugged. You would need someone with more experience with the subject. Olga sighed, rubbing her brow. Of course. Hey guys. Ritska's call came from further in the cave. A type of elation was present in his voice. Guys. Director. We found him. Ash and Olga instantly shot out of their seats. Chaldi a group Pav. I said we were close, not that we had found him. Sullivan remarked in an irritated tone of voice directed towards the master. The boy rubbed the back of his neck nervously, eyes darting away from the caster servant. Sullivan sighed after a few moments, turning to the screen with Da Vinci. Regardless, you are not incorrect that we have narrowed down our location significantly. That's right, Mr. Protagonista. Da Vinci grinned. We've identified a ley line way north of you. How north? Nero strode forwards, her hands on her hips with a stern expression on her face. We must prepare at once. For how long do we ride? Da Vinci's smile seemed to strain slightly. She and Sullivan looked at each other, as if exchanging some hidden conversation between them before looking back to the assembled group. The genius coughed into her hand. Well, I know how much cardio is important for the body. Da Vinci. Olga stared at the woman, unable to hide the growing sense of dread that was building within her. How far away are they? Well, they are in Augusta Trevorum. Da Vinci replied. Nero went silent for a few moments, staring blankly at the screen for what felt like hours before she flattened out her expression. For those of us unfamiliar with Roman territories. Olga gestured for her to hurry up. Sullivan took this as an opportunity to step forwards. I believe that you refer to it as Trier. Quote. For those of us who don't know about every little location in Europe. It's 360 off miles from where you are. Da Vinci offered. Olga gave her a blank look. Ash scratched his brow, sniffing slightly. A silence permeated throughout the assembled group as they all looked around each other for a few moments. Well, Ash coughed into his hand, breaking the silence to offer forth his wisdom. Shit. Yes. Quite troubling indeed. Sullivan dryly retorted. If we leave now we may get there by, maybe. He seemed to make a thoughtful noise for a few moments before he finished his sentence. Yes, we may get there by the end of next week. I don't suppose you have a faster method of transport available. Nero turned to Olga and Ritska with a slightly pleading expression. The boy turned to look at his superior, almost mirroring the emperor's subtle begging not to have to walk so far. We do not. Olga dashed their hopes with a strained expression of her own. How are you faring in terms of fighting power? 1,300. Vespasian answered, his head having fallen into his hands, and only 300 horses between us. I shall inform thee now. Gwyndolin interrupted them. I cannot call forth that many horses, before thee begs for my aid. The god went back to remaining silent, sat in the corner of the room, the snake legs looking around and occasionally staring at someone who got too close. Namely the emperor, who had occasionally poked them. So. Da Vinci clapped her hands together, giving the best enthusiastic smile she could as she stared at the group. Better get moving quickly then, right? I'll let the others know. Ash informed Ritska, turning around and departing the building they were in as he made his way to where the other servants were gathered. Worry not, pale rose. Nero grabbed the director's hands in her own. You may ride in my carriage if you do not wish to walk the way there. Go on, director. Da Vinci grinned mischievously. You can do it. Of course, your subordinates may join. Nero waved a hand at the pair. With how much help they have provided to us, it would be wrong to allow such individuals to traipse through the roads on their feet like the common soldier. Well, that's a very nice offer. Ritska replied to her, holding his hands up in a placating manner, but I'm fine. Are you sure, senpai? Mash sent him a worried glance. Ritska leaned over and whispered to her. Gareth says I might be able to ride Sif. He's a giant wolf, no way am I turning that down. Senpai, Mash sweat dropped, then paused. Is he comfy to ride? I've ridden him twice. Ritska nodded his head. He's very soft. Do you want to ride him too? Well. She coughed slightly, a small flush on her cheeks. I wouldn't, would he be alright with it? Never know if we don't ask. You have some other method of transport. Nero tilted her head at the pair. They both turned back to the Emperor. Ritska nodded his head with a small smile. Yeah, giant wolf, if we're lucky. Ah. Nero grinned, the beast that wields a sword. How did you come upon such a thing? It was so marvelous to gaze upon. How soft is its fur? Soft. Ritska nodded his head sagely, very soft. Would I be able to touch it? I don't see why not. Servants Pav. Sif suddenly tilted their head, their eyes squinted in a confused manner. Something Gareth caught onto as she stopped brushing his fur, something wrong. The wolf let out a confused whine. Gareth frowned, then shrugged her shoulders. Maybe someone was talking about you. I thought that was sneezing. Arash commented with a raised eyebrow. Or am I wrong? What does sneezing have to do with being spoken of? Solaire asked. Arash shrugged at him in response. I just heard it was some kind of superstition. Apparently if you sneeze it means someone is speaking of you. I don't think I've ever sneezed in my life. Beatrice pointed out, then slumped in thought. Oh. There, Solaire pat her on the back. I'm certain you've merely forgotten, undead don't get ill. You probably sneezed plenty of times before you turned. Beatrice seemed to perk up slightly. Why yeah. I'm sure that loads of people have talked about me behind my back. Well, I know that Bedrick mentioned getting help from a witch once. A butterfly, I believe. The moonlight butterfly. Beatrice gaped at him, so that was his name. The undead who summoned me to help him. Yes, I remember him. Butterfly. Arash raised an eyebrow, like the little bugs. Little. Beatrice turned to him with a confused expression. It was the size of a small drake. Oh, a big butterfly then. Gareth nodded her head in understanding, then paused. How come you didn't tell us about that when we were sharing stories? She whined. That sounded pretty impressive. Well, Beatrice blushed, looking away. I didn't do that much. Nonsense. Bedrick had nothing but praise for your aid. Solaire cut her off with a fierce gusto in his voice. He made many compliments about your skill during our talk. Really? She flushed, twiddling her hands. I was useful. My dear. You really should have more pride in yourself. Solaire shook his head. You may not have succeeded where you thought it mattered, but that does not detract from your other achievements. Well, good news. Ash called out as he approached the group. They all looked up towards him. We believe we have found Aldrich. That's good. Arash smiled. So we'll be done with this soon then. So, what is the less than good news? Solaire asked with a small sigh. I suspect it is the next thing you will tell us. He is currently 300 miles north of our location. Well, bugger. Beatrice bluntly stated, her face flat. How long is it going to take us to get there? Around a week. Ash shrugged. Well, a week for the Romans anyway. They are desperately low of manpower and transportation. They are also our only allies. Arash pointed out, we're going to have to walk with them. I don't know if we can launch an assault ourselves, considering we don't actually know what's waiting for us aside from what Solaire described. Then there is Aldrich. Ash winced. If he has the Grail, he has likely been using it to his advantage. To do what? He could use the abilities of those he consumed. Ash sighed. If he can summon servants to his command. That's disgusting. Gareth scowled. Arash frowned in response. Not to mention dangerous. If he can use the noble phantasms of servants he's consumed, then that places him on a pretty high threat. Especially if he's consumed more than one. He cast a glance at Ash. How many different abilities did he use when fighting you? Several. A scythe that seemed to steal my life force to heal himself, the arrow rain of Gwyndolin as well as some manner of weapon-like catalyst. He paused, although it might be that he could also fabricate those he dreamed of as well, considering that the owners of both of those, aside from Gwyndolin, had been dead for some time. Dream. He was clairvoyant to an extent, I believe. He frowned. I do not know if it was vague or specific, but all I know is that he was capable of seeing hints of the future, even that knowledge came from what little information I was able to extract from his soul. You can do that. Gareth blinked. Solaire, Beatrice, Ash and the Firekeeper nodded as one. It is only a trickle of information. Solaire informed her, not nearly enough to form a complete story, but enough to grant some understanding of the world, certainly with the more potent souls you acquire anyway. The ones who have a greater impact on the world as a whole. Huh, that's a little morbid but also kind of impressive. It is what it is. Solaire shrugged his shoulders, turning back to Ash, so when are we to depart? Soon, I suspect. He looked back over the group with a puzzled frown. Where are the others? Sir Vrindari is away running drills with the Roman legionnaires. Solaire informed him, he believes they will need some more experience for the coming days. Esargoff is currently recovering from his bout with the spider, much to Lady Quaylog's insistence. Really? Ash tilted his head. She seems unusually close to him, does she not? Much like a doting mother. Solaire chuckled. Although I would not recommend making such comments in her presence, she might just burn up with embarrassment. As a pyromancer, it would likely be in the most literal sense. Ash snorted, most likely. The hunter. Lucian passed by, he's currently tending to the wounded. It turns out he is a healer of sorts. He is. Solaire nodded his head. It surprised me too, but he merely claimed that if you take something apart, you must first know how it is put together. That's telling. Arash shrugged, but I don't think he's wrong, and if he wants to use his skills to help the soldiers, then I don't have a problem with it. If you're wondering about the two giant suits of armor. Gareth called out to him, continuing to brush Sif's mane as the wolf had its eyes closed, allowing the knight to continue to pet them. They're currently near the front of the city, guarding in case anything else turns up. That's fortunate, I suppose. Ash commented, still, I suspect we shall be in for quite the uphill battle, even with our numbers as high as they are. Most definitely. Solaire nodded. It is always when you approach the end, that the quest seems more difficult. Well, no use worrying about that now. Arash pushed off the ground, standing up fully and cracking his joints, at least until we get there, I suppose that is one way of looking at it. Solaire replied as he stood up as well, matching Arash's upbeat attitude with one of his own. Milord. Cecilia nodded to Ash as he approached her, thou art well. As well as could be expected. He replied, smiling down at her, and yourself. I realize you never did engage much in conversation with others before. Milord, thou worries too much over trivial details. The firekeeper shook her head, a tiny smile on her face. While I am not masterful in the act of conversing, such things are not impossible for me. I wasn't doubting you. He replied back, I was merely concerned, I know you're better at it than I am. Milord, thee should not speak falsehoods. Cecilia cut him off with a small frown, thou art more skilled than thee gives accolade to. Ash sighed, not as good as you make me out to be, I'm still at a loss as to this entire situation. Very much what is the correct term? Improvising it. Milord, thou art far too critical. Shaking her head, the firekeeper rose to her feet. Thee have done a fine job, thy summoner is more welcoming thus far. He is a good child. Ash acknowledged, a good child in a poor situation, although I suppose we have that in common. He muttered under his breath, well, at least the situation part. Milord, thou should not dwell too heavily on the final act. Cecilia cupped his cheek, giving him a reassuring smile. 'Twas not an act born of malice, there is nothing to regret in the outcome. I know that. Ash mumbled quietly, but I know. Cecilia's smile turned more sorrowful. I know how greatly it troubles thee, but thou spoke of the painter Arya, should that not calm thy nerves? It is a cold comfort. Ash turned away from her, a cold comfort from a cold place. I wonder what the dark had truly become by the end, if it could so easily produce creatures like Aldrich. Milord, the saint abused his power. He abused it remarkably easily. Was the rely she received instantly, a slight edge in his tone. It took him no great skill, and then there was Wolnir, the Watchers, his shoulders hitched. Time after time groups rose to challenge the abyss or abuse it, they all fell to it in the end. Becoming monsters, he looked back at her, something flickering through his eyes. Was my choice correct? Did thou wish to propagate the flame? No. Ash's eyes hardened. No. I could not allow that. Then thy choice was the correct one. A choice between a future uncertain or a certain future abusive in nature. Ash scoffed. What choices I had. Milord. No. That's my fault. I should focus on the here and now. Ash cut her off, closing his eyes and exhaling through his mouth. There are those who require my aid here, that is what I should prioritize. Cecilia watched him, a small frown flittered across her face as Ash retreated back the way he came. The other servants continued their conversations as they prepared themselves for the march north. She would never cease worrying about her lord, and she suspected that he was troubled by their betrayal of their own cause even now. Although she would not confess to him that even she was unsure by the end of it, as she had died before she saw the flame flicker out. Quite what that meant, she wasn't sure. We're in the final stretch now. Meaning that the next chapter or two will cover the end of the Singularity. So this one is more filler than anything else, which is why it's only 6,000 odd words rather than the new 7,000, 8,000. Then we'll be off again. Anyway. Considering today is Valentine's Day. Also I uploaded this as a special bit on space battles. But we'll have it here too. The Valentine dialogue of Ash, Sigward, Nameless King and Archon. If they were in-game servants. Enjoy. In-game dialogue from MC. Servant actions. Item descriptions. Valentine Day servant roster, Singularity. France no Gale because we haven't properly met his saber version. Ash. Sigward. Nameless King. Archon, the Silver Knight. Ash. Receiving from MC. Humming, Ah, Master. You're looking rather spry this day. Although I suppose there is an air of merriment about. It's actually rather strange. It's actually a special holiday today. A holiday, you say? That sounds most intriguing. A holiday. I admit, I have never taken part in one. Sigward might have though. I am curious, what is it about? It's Valentine's Day. It's about showing gratitude. Valentine. A day of showing gratitude, you say? Ha. Sounds quite wonderful, truly. That would explain the air of joy. However, I confess my ignorance might have gotten the better of me in this situation. I am afraid I have nothing to gift you. That's all right. Here you go. This is Master. Well, I'm actually worried I may have blushed a bit, ha ha ha. Dear me, getting all worked up over a gift. However. No. This will not do. Remain where you are, Master. I shall be back momentarily. Runs off. He ran off so fast. Runs back. I apologize for the delay, I'm afraid it took some time. Here you go, Master. This is my gratitude for your company. Gifts you item. A tiny model bonfire. Ha ha ha, sorry. I'm afraid the intricacies are still beyond me, but it will provide comfort to you. They always did for me in harsh situations. Well, even when I knew what they truly represented, there was still that small element of gratitude. So, I hope this brings you a much needed sense of calm during trying times. A small bonfire model, handcrafted by Ash. The minute flame that flickers below the coiled sword is warm, and comfortably so. Whenever you hold your hand near it, you feel a sense of serenity. Sigward. Gifting to MC. Knocking on door. Master. Master. It is I, Sigward of Katarina. May I enter? Sure thing. Door opens, thank you. I am sorry to disturb you, but I have heard something truly wonderful. Is it true that today is a special day for Chaldea? If you mean, is it Valentine's Day? Then yes. Ha ha ha. Splendid. In that case, I need not worry about embarrassing myself with this. Gives you gift. Sigward. This is. Ha ha ha. Speechless. I don't blame you, the others I presented with were similarly surprised by this present. It's a chocolate onion. Onion. It is the ceremonial helm of a Katarina Nig. Quote comma quote. Quote comma quote. Quote dot dot dot. Oh. Oh yes. I see it now. I've got myself into a bit of a pickle now, I suppose. You don't need to worry too much about it. It looks great. Really. Oh, thank you for the compliment. I was worried that I had gotten it all wrong, you see. However, even with my failing taste buds, I can still work a kitchen. Even the good archer who prepares the food was surprised. I'm still shocked you can cook without tasting food. Ha ha ha. Such things are simple. Once you get the hang of cooking a few hundred times, you get the timings all worked up in your head. Still, I have never made chocolate before. I admit my skill in such things may be lacking. Don't worry, I'm sure it's fine. With such confidence in my craft from you, master, I suppose I need not fear. Well, I shan't keep you long. I have other chocolates to deliver. You're doing others. But of course, if this is a holiday, it is best to be enjoyed by everyone. Although some of the others have proven more hostile to the idea so far. But I will not be dissuaded. Good luck then. I thank you, master. I will take my leave of you now. Leaves room. Dot dot dot. This chocolate really does look like an onion. Styled to look like the helm of a knight of Katarina, this chocolate unfortunately looks very much like the vegetable the knights are often accused of appearing to be. However, for a man with no taste buds, Sigward is probably one of the best cooks in Chaldea, and this chocolate solidifies his status. Nameless King. Giving to MC. You are here. I came as fast as I could. I know. Impressive, I had only sent you the message a few minutes ago. To get to the other side of Chaldea in such little time. I am gladdened to see your training has been paying off. So, what did you call me here for? A direct question, but I understand your position. It might be considered unreasonable for me to call you out here all of a sudden. However, remember that all warriors of sunlight must be prepared to move at a moment's notice. You are no exception. I see. In any event, you are here now. It has come to my attention that there is a festival occurring today. The exchanging of gifts of some variety. Valentine's Day. Is that its name? Regardless, I found myself curious as to how one would best express their involvement in this time, so I sought advice. Really? From who? Quetzalcoatl. Oh. Indeed. She was actually rather useful, although calling her Little Kusin appears to have inspired some, mixed reactions from her. I do not see the issue. Although perhaps she is a little upset I flaunt my age. You're technically the oldest spirit in Chaldea. Not quite the. Actually, you may be correct. No, there is also the old red knight and the shrewd merchant. I'm the oldest divine spirit. Quote. I feel as though I have gotten off topic. Clears throat. Little cousin Kodal suggested that I gift you something I feel represents my feelings towards you. I'm not entirely certain why she suggested food afterwards. Anyway. Here you go, I had Andre create it specifically for you. Gives item. Oh, wow. Thanks. It's a spear. No. It's a sword. Wait. Ha ha ha. It is a sword spear. Not as basic as mine, but not as advanced as the one Ornstein wields. If it is a holiday about gifting, then I will grant you this. And also instruct you with as well, personally. Oh. You don't need to do the nonsense, master. Storm has actually gotten quite excited at the prospect recently, and I admit I am a little impressed at how quickly you got here. Therefore, it is only right I see that speed put to better use. I regret being so quick. A basic sword spear made like the Nameless King's. It's a little unwieldy, but he says it will become simpler to use with time. It appears to have been infused with trace amounts of lightning, as the tip will occasionally crackle. Archon, the Silver Knight. Receiving from MC. Shows Archon standing guard. Hey, Archon. My liege. Is there something you require of me? Yep. Simply name it, and it will be done. I need you to accept this. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, comma, quote. Apologies, my liege, do you need this delivered to someone? Yes, you. Oh, I see. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, dot, dot, dot. I'm not entirely certain, if you shall pardon my confusion, as to why you have gifted me this. It's Valentine's Day, and I wanted to show my gratitude to you. Quote, dot, dot, dot. My liege, you needn't have bothered. I am merely serving my role. Gratitude is not necessary. Don't be like that. It's a special time of year. That may be so, my liege, but. No buts. Except the chocolate. Quote, dot, dot, dot. If my liege commands it, I suppose I have no choice. You said it was a special time of year. Yeah. Valentine's Day. I see, and what does this day entail? You show your gratitude and affection for someone in giving them a gift. I see. So you are showing your gratitude and affection to me. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, dot, dot, dot. By the flames. I have failed to procure you anything. Archon. Or you Al. This is a grave failure on my part. Worry not, my liege. I will correct this oversight immediately. It was my own ignorance which has led to this moment of embarrassment. Runs off. I feel as though I should have explained that better. Later, in Master's room. Knocking on the door, my liege, 1,000 pardons for the intrusion, but I must speak with you urgently. Sure, come on in. My thanks. Enters room. I have come to correct my oversight earlier, and I hope this will make amends for my failure. Gives gift. Archon. This is. Indeed. Only those of the highest nobility in Orlando were seen fit to wear circlets. While I had no access to the divine materials necessary, nor the skill to reach their craftsmanship, I made such a circlet that I believe reflects your authority. I didn't know you could do metal work. I am a mere amateur as things stand, my liege, you should not burden yourself with false hopes for any future works of mine. Are you kidding me? This is amazing. Your praise is, truly gratifying, my liege. I am glad to have met your expectations. Thanks a lot, really. I only hope this forgives my earlier blunder. Now, if you will excuse me, my liege, I will no longer distract you. A silver circlet with a symbol of the sun emboldened on it. If one looks close enough, they can see small fragments of yellow jewels lining the star to give it a certain shine. Well crafted and perfectly suited to your head, a symbol of nobility for those in Orlando, although even if it is just a copy of such an item, it is still of exceptional make. Chapter 42. Invited to dinner. Master's Pav. It places us currently around 80 miles from Aldrich location. Olga pointed towards the map. We currently have no idea as to what manner of defenses he has available. However, from what we have encountered, we can expect more of the chimeras as well as the strange servant that Soler encountered in Valenzium. So, what are we thinking? Ritska cupped his chin. We could just have Goff use his bow and just blast the city from far away. Olga raised her hand to present a counter-argument, then paused in realization that it actually wasn't a terrible plan before she stopped herself, turning to Sullivan. Were you capable of erecting defensive fields? Yes. Sullivan responded immediately, being sat at the far end of the table with his arms crossed. My own defensive field around Irithyll was based upon his own. He gestured his head over to Ash. Your unkindled can attest to its effectiveness. Their heads turned to Ash. The servant gave a quick nod in response. There was only a single one in place on the bridge. However, without the doll to act as a key, it deflected anything that would attempt to pass through it. Including my more powerful pyromancies. Cupping his chin, the unkindled's expression turned thoughtful. Whether or not it could also deflect a projectile as powerful as whatever Goff can produce, I do not know, but it will repel us. They can, however, only cover a small radius. Sullivan provided, if Aldrich is employing such a barrier, which I have no doubt he is, it will only cover his inner sanctum. Can you get us through? Olga inquired. Sullivan mulled it over in his head before giving his answer. With enough preparation, I should be able to craft some items to allow you to pass through the barrier, however I will not be able to craft many. How many do you think you can? Enough for you and your servants. He replied. His eyes flicked over to Nero. One more if she is feeling suicidal. Ha! Nero barked out a laugh. I have not come this far to allow myself to be relegated to the rear guard. This emperor will face the rival to Rome on the. A simple yes would have sufficed. Sullivan cut her off with a tired sigh, rubbing his wooden brow. Nero pouted at him, which he promptly ignored. With the caster of the spiders dead, it is unlikely you would need to concern yourself with any more, the few that remain will be directionless and easy pickings. Good news then. Okay, so Aldrich will probably be in the center of the city. Ritska leaned over the table, staring at the map. This right here. Placing a single finger on the city plans, he brought the attention of the group to him. The forum, that seems as good a spot as any, right? It lies in the center of the city and at the spot of most significance. Ash admitted, leaning over the table to stare at the architectural plans. From what little I know of Aldrich, it is the most likely place he would take up residence. His ego would allow nothing less. Sullivan commented, it also sits above a ley line in the region, thus it works out to his advantage to secure himself there. Alright, so we can assume Aldrich is here and protected by a field of some kind, right? Ritska looked around the room for confirmation. When he got it he went on. So, all we need to do is clear out the city and then rush in and defeat this guy before he can open up his portal to hell. Hell. Ash mouthed to himself in confusion. He looked around the room and saw that very few others offered the similar state of confusion, save the baffled look on Nero and Vespasian's face followed by the slight creasing of Sullivan's eyebrows being the only evidence of his own confusion at the word. Very colorful, Fujimaru-kun. Romani's head appeared, and you're also right about the portal aspect. From Da Vinci's little gizmo you've been taking with you it looks like there's some crazy readings coming from Augusta Trevorum. Ritska's eyes were drawn to the strange metal globe they had been carting around with them. The device had several small rings which moved around it in tandem, eerily reminding him of Chaldea's except for the fact it was green. Is that what this thing does? He muttered out. I'm not entirely sure what it does. Da Vinci's explanation went over my head. Romani shrugged, although she has a habit of using several paragraphs to explain something that could be done in maybe 5 sentences, so it's not my fault. It's a scanner, just leave it at that. Olga sighed, rubbing her brow in frustration as she straightened herself out. Moving on, we should continue our strategy meeting. Ash. You fought Aldrich, what can you tell us of his capabilities? Powerful sorceries. Ash listed off, a scythe which stole my life force and healed himself with it, minor use of teleportation and use of Gwendolyn's powers, in regards to his bow. He will be slow however, but he makes up for it in durability. Anything else? His main body is comprised of flesh chunks. Ew. Romani and Ritska cringed at the description with Nero scrunching up her face like she sucked a lemon. And is only an avatar. The room I was in was actually, well, Ash paused, cupping his chin in thought as he considered how he would word it correctly. His true form is sludge, so I believe I spent most of the fight ankle deep in him. That's disturbing. Well, the contents of his meals were the real issue, and the smell was certainly. We don't need any more, Ash-san. Mash interrupted him with a polite smile, the corners of her mouth twitching as she tried to suppress her grimace. Oh, before I go. Romani looked over to Ritska with a tiny, somewhat strained smile. Happy birthday, Fujimaru-kun. The boy blinked at him, then slumped his shoulders in realization. Huh, forgot about that. Yeah, Romani gave a tiny chuckle, awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck. Sorry. What are you now, 19? Quote. 17. 17. Olga sputtered, what am I doing with children in Chaldea? Don't look at me. Romani held up his hands in surrender. I just found out now. I knew he was young, I didn't think he was that young. He's practically a child. What happened to parental consent? Child employment. Well, his master aptitude was so high that it looks like we couldn't exactly overlook him. He shrugged. I think the plan was to train him in an on-site apprentice-style program. Now I'm feeling a little self-conscious. Ritsuka looked away from the pair and towards Mash. It's not that weird, right? I'm only 16 myself, senpai. Mash offered with a reassuring smile. I don't think it's that weird. Oh, Ritsuka let out a sigh of relief. Thank goodness. Blinking, he turned to Olga. Wait, how old are you, director? I beg your pardon. The woman whirled on him. What type of question is that? Where did you learn your manners? Sorry. Ritsuka held up his hands in surrender as a panicked look came onto his face. I was just curious is all. If you must know, I'm 23. Wow. The boy blinked, giving her an innocent smile. You look good for your age. Quote. What? Ritsuka blinked at the woman as her expression slowly thinned out. I'm going to. Sullivan slowly stood up from his chair, turning around. Solve. Yeah. He quickly departed the room, having little interest in sticking around for whatever was about to happen next. Ash's eyes darted from Ritsuka to Olga, the woman's face being a perfect mask. Except for her eyes, which looked like they could have outmatched the intensity of the first flame at its height. Vespasian obviously saw something similar, as he was staring at Ritsuka in the same way someone would stare at a dead man. Ritsuka, meanwhile, was completely ignorant to the growing danger he was in, looking around the room in confusion at the sudden shift in tone. What? What's wrong? It's just that the director looks pretty young. Quote. Senpai. Mash cringed at him, not having the courage to face the director, but certainly feeling the sheer anger that was pouring off her being right now. Nero, however, blundered into the situation with the same amount of grace which she usually carried about. Much to the growing despair of Vespasian and Romani, you do have the youthful visage almost akin to a child. I suspect you take the greatest of care with your skin to ensure such a smooth finish. As if to prove her point, she crossed the distance between the two of them and began to rub Olga's cheeks with the back of her hand, as I suspected. The emperor grinned in triumph, as if she had won some great achievement. Romani looked as though he was watching a car crash occurring in slow motion with no discernible way to stop it. Carrie, having snuck up behind him, was grinning like a maniac with the small camera in her hands, holding it up and getting a good focus on the scene in front of her. The click of the camera was signaled the snapping of Olga's temper. Servant's Pav. Arash paused in his carving, furrowing his brow and looking off in the direction of the command tent with a raised eyebrow. Huh. Wonder what happened. HMPH. Beatrice looked away from her makeshift catalyst, repairing the one that had been broken in the fight with Gundyr. Something wrong? No, probably nothing, Betty. Arash waved off her concern, although I think one of my seeings has just come to pass. Seeings? I'm a little clairvoyant. He shrugged. Nothing special, although I had perceived great danger towards Master for a few days now. Wait, what? The woman dropped the catalyst. Shouldn't we? I didn't say it was life-threatening. Arash calmed her down. I think he just made a small blunder is all. I can guess what it was. Solaire mused, looking away from his sword as he sat his whetstone down, a tiny smile on his face as he nodded towards the entrance of the tent, just in time for red-faced Olga to come storming out of it, muttering a storm of curses under her breath. Her berserker followed after her, having been stood guard at the entrance flap. Wonder what happened to set her off this time. Arash mumbled, then let out a sigh of exasperation when he saw Ritsuka emerge, a large red-shaped handprint on his cheek and a look of utter bewilderment on his face. Never mind, I think I figured it out. Beatrice looked between the two of them. You did. I believe what Arash alludes to, Lady Beatrice. Solaire turned to her, is a classic example of boot in mouth. I'll say. Arash chuckled, shaking his head in obvious amusement. Poor kid probably doesn't know how to speak to women. I'm probably not much better. The Sun Knight admitted with a small shrug of his shoulders and a hapless expression. I never found myself having much luck with women. Really? Arash blinked at the man. Why not? Well, there's something strange I feel right now. You too. You refer to some odd connection despite us never having met before. I do, it's strange. It is. Ash nodded his head, having swiftly left the command tent following Ritska's debacle and then encountering the rather reserved member of their camp. Maybe it's because we're both cursed. Lucian offered with a tiny shrug as he moved into the medical tent, Ash following after him. Can't think of much else. Possibly. Ash nodded his head. Then again, I have met some unkindled before, but none seem to exude this level of familiarity. Really? Lucian muttered as he crouched down next to the sounded man, looking over his injuries. I suppose I can relate. I have met many hunters before but none felt like you do. He looked over his shoulder back at Ash. Odd. Indeed. Ash replied, then looked down at the wounded man. How are their injuries coming along? They've made good progress last few days. Lucian muttered, your fancy parlor tricks have helped. I wasn't much for the arcane anyway, preferred to use my hands. I can see, you are quite skilled for a man who claims to hunt things. Probably a doctor before. He shrugged, or some kind of surgeon. Can't remember much before the blood. You as well. Ash blinked. I confess, my memories before rising from my grave are missing as well. Maybe that's why we're kindred spirits. The man mused. Ash gave a grunt of acknowledgement. Doesn't matter. Got patients to deal with. Heard we're almost there. Need every man we can get. We are close, yes. Ash nodded. You will dealing with the strange creature. Yeah. He affirmed. Killed it before. Can kill it again. I killed Aldrich before. Ash muttered, and the large suit of armor patrolling the camp. The one on fire or the one with the big axe? The second one. Lucian grumbled, then paused and began to slowly look back over at Ash. Weird how we're fighting things we've killed before. I would say it ain't right, but there's us coming back from the dead. I suppose this is certainly a new perspective for me. Ash mused, I wonder if this is how my opponents felt well they killed me, only for my reanimated body to walk back through the doors within the same hour. You too, You rise from the dead repeatedly as well. More times than I care to. Lucian grumbled under his breath, the pair following into a short silence before the hunter loosened the bandage around the man's leg, staring down at the wound with a blank expression. Bones been righted, no sign of infection. He cast a glance towards Ash. Gonna need some arcane. Ash nodded his head, holding out his palm and allowing the glowing orb to form just above the man. The gentle rays of light gradually began healing the wounds. Impressive. Lucian grunted, rising to his feet. Any side effects? It takes long to fix damage to bones. Ash replied, and it is not as effective as miracles when it comes to healing. That it? At Ash's nod, Lucian let out a mirthless scoff. Looks pretty miraculous to me. Phew. Lucian abruptly jolted, spinning around and staring down at the small white rodent which had snuck into the tent. Phew. 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 Ash looked down at the animal with a raised eyebrow. I thought you did not usually stray far from MASH, what are you doing here? Lucian flattened out his features, calming his nerves until he was breathing at an acceptable rate. I won't start anything if you don't. He spoke down to it, who stared at him for several seconds as if trying to discern his intentions before it nodded to itself. Spinning around, the small animal trotted out of the tent, leaving Lucian and Ash behind, the latter somewhat confused as to the nature of the exchange. Just an agreement with the beast. Lucian grunted, waving away the question he knew was building in Ash's head, nothing more. I see. Ash shrugged. I will admit, Fu does seem more intelligent than one would expect. Quote. You can't see it, can you? Well, Ash paused. There is something about the way he feels that sometimes puts me on edge, but aside from that I cannot say I understand your meaning. HMPH. The hunter grunted, small mercies. Quelaag stood next to Goff, the large giant staring off across the horizon. I can see it, you know. The sun. Ha! Goff snorted, shaking his head. No, Lady Quelaag, I referred to our destination. The city where the devourer Aldrich resides. Quelaag pursed her lips. How? How old is Gwyndolin? Quote. Older than I. Older than Gwyn. He would speak not of it. Goff replied in a somber tone, casting a glance down at the Chaos Witch. I fear he has been alone too long, I sense a deep emptiness in him. The Chaos Witch let out a scoff. He was always sullen, came with his territory. She dismissed, although her attempt was half-hearted at best. He thought the moon was to represent melancholy, so he turned himself into that. Gwyn raising him as a girl did him no favors with his attitude. I cannot confess that Gwyn was a perfect father. Ho! Quelaag smirked up at Goff, how treasonous. However, he continued on, although his tone indicated he found the comment somewhat amusing. However now, that melancholy is reason. He took to Lady Staino so quickly because I believe he merely wanted the company of another lord again, letting out a quiet sigh, his shoulders slumped. Not that Lady Staino was poor company, I believe she did well to bring some life back into Lord Gwyndolin. He couldn't have been that bad, surely. Lady Quelaag. Goff paused, unsure of how best he could word it. He would not have been out of place in a painted world. Quelaag recoiled as if slapped, gaping at the giant with wide eyes before they darted off into the camp, seeking out the source of the conversation. The fuck? He can't have been that bad. Goff said nothing in return for a few moments before he looked back across the horizon. We are to begin our assault soon. If thou art to speak with him, do so with haste before the chance slips by. Quelaag wasted no time in spinning around and moving further into the camp, a heavy scowl on her face. Gwyndolin heard her coming long before he saw her. Although he should have been expecting it, if he was being truthful he had expected her to come barging in far earlier. The trip here had likely kept her from doing that. They had been taking few rests along the way. The overhanging sense of urgency in regards to Aldrich had been present. An urgency Gwyndolin shared. If Aldrich were to open up a doorway to the abyss, there would be no stopping such an outbreak. He cast his eyes towards the door of his projected tent as it burst open. Greeting, Lady Quela. Cut it out with that posh shit. She interrupted him. I know you didn't always speak like that. I'm not going to be spending my time here speaking to Gwyn's mouthpiece. Gwyndolin let out a small, nearly imperceptible sigh, although one tinged with a sense of warm nostalgia rather than exasperation at her blunt way of speaking. I suppose that was expected of you. Letting out an amused laugh, he looked over at her, seeing her face set in a heavy frown. You always did dislike the goings-on within court. I much preferred remaining in Izalith. She responded with a roll of her eyes, hearing all those other gods sing the praises of Gwyn Gotthold very quickly. I'm sure it would, if one were not used to such honors. Gwyndolin countered, you only attended court maybe a dozen times in 1,000 years. Quelaag froze, her eyes shadowing over as she stared at Gwyndolin. Lyn, it was 3,000. It was. Gwyndolin let out a small hum. I suppose my memory might be failing me, although I was summoned in my prime, so I suppose I might still be assorting my memories in order. Lyn. Quelaag advanced on him slowly, her shadow falling over the lord who made no effort to move, still staring at the mouth of the spider serving as her lower half. Lyn, how old are you? That might be difficult for me to answer, Lady Quelaag. Gwyndolin replied in a tired tone of voice, almost slumping in his chair. You know how time began to break in Lordran towards the end of the Age of Fire. It happened so often that I could not give you an accurate number. Gwyndolin. Quote. I did stop counting eventually. Gwyndolin shrugged. It took some time for me to cease concerning myself with the passage of time. Quelaag leaned towards him, her hands reaching out slowly towards the sun-like crown on his head. Gwyndolin made no move to stop her as she gently clasped the underside of the spikes at the side and lifted it up, slowly revealing his face. Pale white skin made him look like a porcelain doll. The platinum blonde hair flowed down freely from his head, resting just at his shoulders. The effeminate face slowly looked up towards Quelaag. She stared back at him with a slight grimace. His eyes, which had once held the brightest shine of gold within them, were now nothing more than a dull yellow, glazed over with little strength in them. If you must know. Gwyndolin stared up at her, eyes flicking to the side. I stopped counting after 100,000. Quelaag almost choked, dropping the helm onto the floor with a heavy clang, completely ignoring as it rolled away from her. Gwyndolin's only reaction was a small flinch at the noise. The broken fragments of time likely raised the number considerably. In truth, I do not know how old I am. What the fuck? Please, Lady Quelaag. Gwyndolin chided her in a childlike tone, although his eyes held no life in them. Crude language such as that is not fit for one of your status, looking meaningfully at the spider torso, even in your present condition. My present condition. Quelaag snarled at him. My condition. What about you? How long were you alone? What happened to Guinevere? For the first time in their conversation, Gwyndolин's eyes sprung to life. With burning hatred. Guinevere. He replied through gritted teeth, saw fit to leave at the first sign of danger to the flame. Along with all other gods in Anorlando. Even after the flame was revitalized, they never saw fit to return. Quelaag recoiled, eyes wide. But what about everyone else? All the nobles. Dead, old age consumed them long ago. Quelaag's eyes softened. Lyn, how long were you alone? Esser Ornstein had been one of the few to remain at his post, until he departed. He left. To find Farum. Gwyndolin gave an empty smile. It came as no surprise. Ornstein always held him in such high regard, although given his final role, it came as a greater surprise that he did not do so sooner. Lyn, do not look upon me like that. Gwyndolin shook his head. I did find company eventually, towards the end anyway. You're too blaze about this. Quelaag scowled at him. You. Lyn, you're older than even Gwyn was. HMPH. I suppose I am, aren't I? Gwyndolin gave a mirthless chuckle, although still younger than brother. Brought. Quelaag widened her eyes at the implication. He survived. Indeed. Gwyndolin nodded, his expression blanked. It seems he too survived until the very end. The humans outside encountered him in their last venture through time. What? I had thought I would feel some burning rage when I learned that piece of information, that father's purge of his memory had failed to remove all traces of him. Gwyndolin blinked. Instead I felt nothing. How odd, although perhaps I shall feel differently should I ever encounter him again. Lyn. What? Mash recoiled, a hurt look flashing across her face as Quelaag whirled on her with a snarl. The chaos witch clicked her tongue and looked away, her expression flattening out. I mean, do you need something? Gwyndolin let out a melodious laugh causing Quelaag to shoot a glare his way. The Lord simply smiled back at her before turning towards Mash. Wast there something thee did need? Sorry to disturb you, Gwyndolin san. Mash bowed her head guiltily. Speaketh thy peace, then depart. Senepi says that we're about to go, he just wanted to let you know. She sent a glance towards Quelaag. Sorry for interrupting, Quelaag san. TCH. The chaos witch clicked her tongue again, shaking her head. Don't apologize, that was my bad. Gwyndolin raised an eyebrow at her, then sent another glance over to Mash. The girl froze as the eyes of the god seemed to be scanning her now. narrowed slightly as he observed every inch of her before he seemingly found what he was looking for. Nodding to himself, I offer mine own congratulations, pygmy mash. Lady Quelaag doest not oft apologize. Clearly thou art quite dear to her already. What nonsense are you spewing forth now? The chaos which snapped at him, she's just less annoying than others, don't read too deeply into it. Forsooth, perhaps mine own fusty age is causing delusional visions. Stop talking like that. Quelaag rolled her eyes. I know you enjoy the whole, dark and brooding, aspect but try not to speak in words than few can understand. Thou always were a slayer of enjoyment, Lady Quelaag. Gwyndolin moaned. One of his snakes reached out, grabbing his helmet and placing it back atop his head, although the tiny smile remained on his face. 'Tis a great pity thee never visited the great theater. That depends on whether or not you wanted to watch me kill a speechwriter for depicting the Great War against the everlasting dragons for the 19th time. Quelaag scoffed. Did they also write out Faram's role in the play? Gwyndolin gave her a flat look behind his helmet, prompting a smirk from Quelaag as she turned away and moved out of the tent, leaning down towards Mash as she passed her. Yes, he is a boy. Mash jolted, shooting Quelaag a look of surprise before looking back at Gwyndolin, then back to Quelaag. But he's so. Quelaag nodded with a smirk, leaving the tent. Masters Pav. These will grant you access, in the event that Aldrich has indeed set up a boundary around his base. Sullivan handed off the small wooden dolls to each individual servant and master. Avoid losing them, it would be most troublesome otherwise. HMPH. Vrindari grunted as he stared at the small doll in his hands, then moved to strap it onto the back of his shield before turning to face Ritska. My liege, how do you props we proceed? Ritska looked to Olga and Nero before nodding once, then turned to face the assembled servants. The plan we have come up with is as follows. We're currently assuming that Aldrich will have the strange servant guarding outside. At which point Lucian, he gestured to the man in dark leather, who gave a single grunt in response, will deal with it, Soler and the Balrog. The what? That's what I've been calling the berserker that's on fire with the horns. Ritska cringed. We don't really know their true name, so I came up with one. I see, apologize for the interruption. Right. Clearing his throat, he carried on, Soler, Lucian and Balrog will hold deal with the giant servant which is apparently a horse as well. Looking over to Lucian he gave a small frown. Is that an issue? Are you asking if I'm stupid enough to turn down help? The hunter responded, a raised eyebrow. Ritska cringed slightly, waving his hands. Sorry, I didn't know if you were one of those, this is my prey, type of hunters. Oh. The man shrugged, I'm not. Well, alright then. He coughed into his hand. The main force that will assault Aldrich will be the servants who came with me, and Nero, along with the director and her berserker, and Gwyndolin. What of the giant? Vrindari grunted, what will it be doing? Quelaag hissed at the man, who showed no indication of caring, will be providing cover from afar, considering his prowess with the bow. I will take to the streets and deal with whatever other freakish little ghouls the abyss spawn has conjured up while you kill him. And where shall you be? Ash directed the question towards Sullivan. The pontiff tilted his head in acknowledgement before raising an eyebrow. If you think I'm going to go waltzing into combat with a man who was capable of devouring gods, you're an even bigger fool than I suspected. However, considering that should the giant see me attempt to flee he will shoot me down. Thou art correct. Indeed. It seems I am forced to follow after the chaos witch and deal with the abominations in the street. He paused, at least until Gwyndolin re-emerges and takes my head. Ritska blinked, looking questioningly towards Olga. The woman remained blank-faced before she sighed. Gwyndolin wants to personally execute Sullivan when the situation here is resolved. Soon scoffing at the disapproving looks she received from Mash and Ritska. Don't look at me like that, it's a personal grudge between them and if it secured the aid of a god, of all things, then I'm not going to waste my time negotiating. Besides, Sullivan is well aware of the agreement. Considering the threat was made to my face, it is rather obvious. Came Sullivan's dry retort before he stared back at the group. I suspect you are almost ready. Nero nodded her head, turning to Vespasian. I hope you are prepared, legate. This battle will decide the fate of Rome. Vespasian gave a small sigh in response, shaking his head. Indeed, my emperor. Now then. Nero pointed her sword towards the city in the distance. Let us begin. She went to rush forwards, only for Vespasian to grimace and stand in front of her. What? My emperor, while I do recognize your zeal, and I wholeheartedly support it. He hastily added on at her growing look of confusion, I believe it would be best to ensure the troops are assembled before we begin our offensive. Ah. Nero blinked, nodding her head. Of course, that makes sense. Truly, you are a tactical genius, legate. Your praise is most welcome, my emperor. Vespasian bowed his head slightly, then turned to Ritska and Olga. Will our giant friend be able to destroy sections of the wall to allow our troops entry? Mine bow can destroy the frontmost section, should they require it. Goff pointed out, then crossed his arms. However, I may only use the skill once, I shall be depleted after. Your noble phantasm. Olga nodded her head. I suppose it is quite powerful. Powerful but localized, I am afraid. Goff awkwardly scratched the back of his neck. It was meant to ground dragons, but I believe it can deal with a wall. This should be good. Arash whispered down at Gareth, a wide grin on his face. We'll get to see a giant use a noble phantasm. I know. Gareth replied in an equally giddy tone. I can't wait. Olga frowned. How much magical energy will you have left? Goff turned thoughtful for a few moments, enough to last an hour afterwards. His helmet looked back towards them, perhaps less. We would need to move quickly then. Olga surmised, turning to Ritska. We'll move out immediately. How many of the wounded can fight? She directed the question to Vespasian. The legate cupped his chin. Thanks to the aid of the strange hunter and the arcane knight, I would say that half of them can reliably hold a sword. He paused, a frown soon coming to his face. However, some are still too wounded. Cecilia. Olga turned to the woman. You have healing spells, do you not? Thou art correct, Lady Animosphere. Cecilia nodded her head. Olga seemed to preen at the respectful tone that the firekeeper directed at her. Does thee wish me to tend to the injured? Ritska nodded his head. No offense to all you've done, but even with the copy of Ash you can make, he trailed off with a grimace. Cecilia shook her head, a look of understanding. Thee need not soften thy words. Mine role was never for combat. Should any be wounded, they can rely on my aid. Nero beamed at the woman, as expected of such a beautiful flower. Such a caring personality to match her exquisite looks. She does know they look the same, right? Beatrice whispered to Sif. The wolf gave her a deadpan expression in response. Oh, you're probably right. Nodding to herself, while not capable of understanding the animal in the least, she did not need to be skilled in the art of communicating with animals to understand what Sif thought of in that moment. I will bring up the legionnaires. Vespasian nodded to the emperor. Those that remain will make our best effort to keep the majority of their forces away from your assault. He cast a glance at Ritska and Olga before moving towards the pair. I am trusting you to ensure the emperor walks out of this battle alive. Narrowing his eyes into a slight glare, the man loomed over them. It would be best if she did, for your sake. Right. Ritska nodded back to him with a determined expression. We won't let anything happen to her. Vespasian studied his expression for a few moments before giving a curt nod, the corner of his lip twitching upwards. Good. He turned away, moving back towards the main body of the troops as they prepared themselves. Do you want me to wish you some words of fortune? Romani asked through the communicator. I've been keeping a little journal of the last few days. As if to prove his point, he held up a small red book in front of him with a proud smile. Roman, why? Ritska raised an eyebrow at the man. Romani pouted in response. Because it's like when all those great generals from history had scribes documenting their journeys. He whined, putting the book down. I mean, no one is probably ever going to read it, but that doesn't take away from it too much, does it? I mean, rubbing the back of his neck, Ritska gave a wry smile. I'd probably read it, but I don't think anyone else outside of Chaldea would be allowed to. They most certainly would not. Olga huffed, turning a glare on Romani. I trust you understand that much, Doctor. Yes, Director. Romani slumped his shoulders, fidgeting on the spot for a few moments before he gave a hopeful smile. Can I keep writing it though? Olga gave him a flat expression for several seconds before she sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose and shaking her head. Very well, provided that it does not leave Chaldea, it can reside in the library. You're the best, Director. What are you, a child? Stop cheering like that. Master Group Pav 1 hour later. Ritska, Olga and the servant stood at the far end of the field. The city walls were well within their sights, as was the dark cloud that churned and rumbled above the city itself. Romani. Can your scans detect anything? Olga asked with a nervous expression as she stared at the cloud. The doctor's face popped up moments later. Although the transmission was static, the doctor's face flashing in and out of existence. Egative, ent, n, obab, orc, distortion, rector, can't. Olga clicked her tongue, turning the communicator off. Looking over to Ritska, she shook her head. It seems that we are too close to the source of the singularity in this era. We will not be receiving aid from Chaldea at this time. Ritska and Mash gave a small nod in response. Ash looked over his shoulder towards the main force of Romans near them. The small array of servants stood just in front of them, all awaiting for the signal to attack. Gwendolyn. Ritska turned to the god. The Lord gave a minor hum of acknowledgement. Can you give Goff the signal? He nodded once. Goff Pav. Thee may loosen when ready, Sir Goff. The illusion of the sentinel informed him, soon disappearing from sight as Goff nodded his head. Hoisting his bow up, he began to knock a single arrow and draw it back to the point where his bow began creaking. Alloweth the winds falleth silent. Alloweth mine own sight beest true. Alloweth mine own arrow fl yeth. Alloweth mine own foe falleth. The arrow at the end of his bow began to glow brightly. A loud roar was heard as the bow began to tremble with the force of the projectile. Goff squinted his eyes at the gate. Loose. Calamitas ruinum. His hand released the string. Master Group Pav. Ritska saw it before he heard it. The single lance of light shooting across the field in an instant, burning brightly as if it were a falling star as it slammed into the gate of the city. Then the implosion came next. The area where the arrow struck expanded in a circle outwards. All the debris which had been blasted away seemed to hang in the air for what felt like an eternity before it collapsed inwards in a split second. With a single shot, the entire front portion of the gate and the wall had been destroyed. Then Ritska heard the clap of thunder akin to a jet engine. Even though Goff had been at least a mile away from them, it was still loud enough that he, Olga and Mash had to cover their ears from the sheer volume of the attack. Arash was simply staring at the broken gate, blinking several times before a wide grin came to his face. Turning his head to stare at the location where Goff was, he raised his hands giving a thumbs up. Clearly receiving the response from the giant that he wanted, as he soon have a short laugh and shook his head. Looking to the side, he saw Gareth gaping at the damage from atop Sif. He gently nudged her with his elbow. Pretty impressive, right? Absolutely. Gareth grinned. That was amazing. She rubbed Sif behind the ears. We have to outdo him, right boy? Sif released an amused howl in response. Ritska slowly took his hands off his ears, turning to Nero, the woman still blinking at the damage. Emperor Nero. The woman gave no response. Emperor. He gently poked her on the shoulder. She turned to him with a confused expression, blinking several times. What? She then shouted in his face. Are you all right? What? I can't hear you. She gestured at her ears. There's a ringing in the air. Ritska sighed, feeling someone give him a pat on the shoulder. He looked over to see Ash staring down at him through the helmet. Perhaps we had best move now. Right. He nodded back to the servant, then looked at Olga, director. Do you want to give them the order? Fine. She sighed, although there was the barest traces of a smile on her face. Opening her mouth to give out the order, she was interrupted by Nero. Ah. We're going now. Charge. Then sprinted forwards as the Romans charged the gate in the distance. Olga gave a blank look in the direction of the emperor as she sprinted away from them and towards the city. I wanted to say that. Olga mumbled under her breath, earning a quiet snort from all the servants who heard her, the closest being Ash, making him the only one to receive the glare in response. Which was magnified when her berserker soon glared at him as well. Ash coughed and looked away, staring towards the back of the emperor before looking down at Ritska. We should probably follow after her, Ritska. Yeah. Ritska nodded his head. Let's go, guys. City attack force servants Pav. It was a bloodbath in every sense of the word. The moment the Romans stormed into the city, they were beset on all sides by abominations of every walk of life. Emaciated corpses stumbled towards them with glowing white eyes and a dark cloud surrounding their bodies, casting low-level sorceries which burned through the shields and scorched the soldiers. There were few of the accursed left, but there were more than enough to present an immediate problem. The mangled forms numbers in the tens as they immediately charged into the thick of the fighting, bodies being sent flying and often in more than one piece as the beasts ripped apart the troops. Solaire slashed his blade through the lower ankle of the second leg of the accursed. The creature let out a snarl as it snapped its jaws towards him. Hefting his shield up, Solaire grunted as it slammed into his defense, attempting to clasp its mandibles around the shield. He responded by shoving a sword into one of its large glowing eyes. The accursed let out a howl of pain from all of its heads as it recoiled. Pressing the advantage, he thrust up and through the throat of the beast, retching his sword to the side and slicing open the neck. The wail became a pitiful gurgle, however it did not relent in its assault, violently thrashing its legs towards him in an attempt to pay him back for the injuries he had caused. A clap of thunder and a second later the side of its head exploded in a shower of gore. Solaire briefly saw Lucien throw away the large pistol as it dissipated back into smoke before he swung his bizarre cleaver, slashing through the shambling corpses with ease. Another cry brought his attention to the right-hand side as the burning armor of the berserker, Balrog. It was an odd name, but if that allowed them to distinguish it, then that was fine by him. It also made him feel better to ascribe a name to the servant rather than berserker. Balrog clasped its clawed hand into the skull of the accursed, slamming its head into the ground as it attempted to break free. The clenching of its hand brought the sound of snapping bone as the skull was broken inwards as it raised the greatsword above its head. It ripped its hand free only to stamp on the accursed's face and pin it to the ground as it hefted its sword above its head. Then thrust downwards, ending the struggling permanently. Solaire would certainly admit that even though he had faced many terrible foes, he would think twice about attacking Balrog. Even under the sun. Nevertheless, discarding the thoughts, he continued his advance, the morning rays strengthening his body as he hacked and slashed through the town's occupants with ease, the Romans slowly but surely following in the wake of the servants. Sullivan danced across the battlefield, the twin great swords in his hands blitzing through the air in streaks of orange and purple. He swung the glowing purple blade down, instantly cutting through the shambling corpse that had been stumbling towards him before slashing the burning greatsword through the air, releasing a small wave of fire from the blade which incinerated a small gathering of the opponents. His head soon turned in the direction of an accursed charging him from down the street. In an almost slow movement, he raised the steel greatsword in his left hand and pointed it towards the rampaging beast. The deep purple light danced across the surface of his blade before shooting towards the accursed in a beam of light, striking the upper portion of its head. A horrific burn lanced across its body as it continued its run, releasing a roar of pain as it lunged towards him. Sullivan stepped to the side as it shot past him, raising the burning greatsword up and cutting across its body. The smell of charred flesh soon followed as the screaming of the beast intensified for a few moments before Sullivan slashed his smaller blade through the accursed's head, silencing it. Releasing a scoff, he flicked the blade clean of the dark blood clinging to it. Master Group Pav. Ash burst through the line, swinging the black blade through the air and leaving a trail of fire in his wake. The hollows were quickly cut down as the servants gradually made their way towards the forum. Ash cast a glance behind him to see how the others were doing. It would not be an understatement to claim that the Dragon Slayer armor had effectively been the main driving force in the attack towards the forum. The giant suit of armor stomped through opposition with minimal delay. Bringing its axe above its head and slinging its shield onto its back, the armor slammed it into the ground with enough force to send a blast of air through the pavement and up the street, ripping through the ground and sending the bodies flying off in all directions. Ritska peeked out from behind Mash with a blank expression before facing Olga. "Director, your servant is actually amazing." "Oh, of course he is." The woman puffed out her chest, a prideful smile on her face. "Were you expecting anything less of the Animosphere family?" "No." Ritska shook his head. It's still pretty amazing." "Save your compliments, as welcome as they are." She muttered the last part quietly under her breath. "Until we have achieved victory here." "Your commander is correct," Verndari commented as he marched past the pair, slashing through a shambling hollow with a grunt of disgust. The top half of the body fell to the ground. The burning light in its eyes continued to shine as it crawled towards the night, the gladius in its hand flicking through the air as it attempted to slash at the heels of anyone close by. Verndari ended its attempted when he stomped down on its skull. "I would advise you keep your mind on the task at hand, my liege. Distractions are hazardous in combat." "Right." Ritska nodded his head, awkwardly looking away. "Sorry. Don't worry too much about it." Beatrice reassured him as she fired off several orbs of blue light towards the hollows down the street, the projectiles piercing through their bodies and causing them to fall to the ground. "I think Verndari is very much a job first type of person. I'm not that used to talking to people though, so I wouldn't know." "I can picture that for him," Ritska admitted easily, narrowing his eyes down the street. "Rash, demon spider person thing. Take out its eyes on it." Seconds later, several dozen arrows instantly buried themselves in the head of the accursed as it rounded the corner, soon screaming in pain and reeling its head back to let loose the acid spit. A beam of blue light flew over their heads, striking the accursed and instantly cutting it in half. Ritska and Beatrice gaped at the damage, turning towards the source of the attack to see Gwyndolin lower his staff and pull out his bow, matching Arash with an arrow spam of his own moving up the street. Said archer raised an eyebrow at the subtle challenge and continued on, clearing the street as they continued their march upwards. "I know he is a god, but I wasn't really expecting that." Ritska muttered under his breath, then paused and shrugged his shoulders. "Although if he is Faram's younger brother, then I guess that makes sense, right? We didn't really see that much of Faram-san in combat, senpai." Mash replied from the front as she blocked spells being launched down from the windows, although Sigward-san said that it took a group of servants to even wound him severely. "Makes sense." He nodded his head, grimacing as they passed by one of the bodies. "What are these anyway?" "They look like the zombies we saw in France, but they appear to be cursed in some manner." Ash commented as they passed him, the servant throwing a chaos orb towards the nearest building, the bright ball of fire destroying the front portion of the house and sending several of the hollows tumbling out while coated in flames. "I encountered their like in Irithyll." Turning back to face them, "They are likely the citizens who lived here." Aldrich did similar to the clerics who served him. "My citizens turned into these monsters." Nero seethed. "Unacceptable." Quite. Ash shrugged his shoulders, looking away from them and pointing upwards. "The entrance to the forum lies ahead. I assume you can see the slight shimmer of air surrounding it." Ritska squinted his eyes at the forum, noticing a strange flickering of light around the building in the shape of a dome, akin to staring at the surface of a still lake as it faintly rippled. "Guess we just need to see if Sullivan was trustworthy, huh?" Ash grunted in response. Ritska could already tell that the man wasn't exactly fond of the idea of relying on him for anything remotely linked to their lives. A white blur shot down the street as Gareth and Sif cut through resistance. The bright flashes of light signified the gunlance detonating while Sif twirled the sword in his mouth, sweeping it through the air with a disturbing level of skill and far more than one would expect from a wolf. Ritska frowned. Doesn't this seem too easy? He questioned out loud. Ash kicked away another husk and then paused, sending a glance Ritska's way before he began to mull over the statement in his head. It does appear to be remarkably easier gaining access to Aldrich's lair than I would expect. He replied with a shrug. However, we are currently fighting on two fronts. It is possible that the concentration of servants on either side and the loss of his allies has significantly lessened his offensive capabilities. Ritska pursed his lips. When you say it like that it makes sense, but I don't know. Something just doesn't feel right. Worry about it later. Olga cut off further musing. We still have an objective to complete and Aldrich lies just ahead. Whether or not this is a trap will remain unknown until it is sprung, and with what lies above our heads, she pointed up towards the dark clouds, now rumbling and circling inwards as the beginnings of an upside-down vortex began to form. I suspect we do not have time to dally. Fair enough. Ritska replied back abashedly, sorry. Don't apologize for it. She frowned at him. Prudence is the sign of a good master. However, the simple fact is we lack the time for it. Our hand has been forced. Wow. You're surprisingly calm, Director. Mash gave the woman a wide smile. That's really impressive. Olga blinked at the compliment, a faint red dusting her cheeks. It's fine. Besides, panicking now would do us no good. As expected of my pale rose. Nero boasted, resting a hand on the director. Such a calm and collected mind. Please, stop. City Assault Force Servants POV. Lucian swung his cleaver through the air, burying it in the torso of the emaciated body. He ripped it forwards, the serrated blade tearing through the body as the man continued to hack his way through the crowd. A small frown upon his face. Where are you? He muttered under his breath, performing a savage haymaker on the nearest corpse, its head disappearing in a misty cloud of remains as it slumped over. Any luck finding our quarry? Solaire asked, throwing a bolt of lightning towards another target before slipping his shield back on. Their numbers are becoming few and yet we have seen no sign of your prey. I know. Lucian grunted, narrowing his eyes. I don't like it. Beasts are dangerous enough, this one was smart in life too. I see. The knight nodded his head, a frown on his lips. Then we are facing a more dangerous foe than believed. You fought them. The hunter pointed out, snapping his blade out and swinging it to the side, bifurcating the nearest undead. You should know. Quote. Yes, I now understand. Solaire muttered, indeed, it was a frightful thing to face. Why it needs to die quickly. He replied, frowning, so where? He paused, noticing something. Why have the arrows stopped? Beg pardon. The giant. Lucian pointed out, he was supposed to be providing support with his arrows. It's not like any of them are silent, so why haven't we heard any more? The pair fell into silence for a few moments before realization set in. You do not believe. Shit. Lucian cursed, spinning on his heel. He went for the camp. Esser Goff is strong, but I doubt he is skilled in combat. Solaire widened his eyes behind his helm. The firekeeper. Come on. Lucian broke into a sprint. We've cleared this part anyway. Indeed. Solaire nodded, looking to the nearest soldier. You. Me. Aulus looked at the man. Yes, Prefect. Aulus. Good man. Solaire nodded to him as Lucian vanished off in the opposite direction. Get word to Lady Quelaag and Sullivan if you are able. Tell them that Sir Lucian and myself are heading to the camp. We believe that it is under attack. Understood, Prefect. The man nodded his head. We'll make sure to clear up any remaining problems here. Good luck. To you as well. Goff Pav. The giant archer grunted as he stumbled backwards, the glowing blue blade arcing upwards and just past his head as the abomination continued its assault. Goff thrust his bow forwards as the beast swung the sword down, locking it in place with his bow before he delivered a savage punch to the horse-like face. The beast stumbled backwards, snarling the whole time before slashing the blade vertically, releasing a wave of energy. Goff held his arms out in a blocking motion as the wave slammed into his arms. He released a hiss of pain as he felt his skin burn on contact with the energy. The copy of the Ashen One slammed into the side of its head, burying the bastard sword into its lower jaw. All it seemed to do was enrage the beast as it lashed out with its free hand, grabbing the projection and throwing it away. Its glassy eyes darted over to the firekeeper. The woman sat just at the edge of the camp. It growled as it span towards her, only for Goff to grip it in a headlock, being only slightly taller than the creature but having far greater mass to his body. The pair wrestled as Goff tightened his hold around its neck with his left arm, his right doing its best to restrain its sword arm. The beast thrashed and kicked with the legs welded to its body, its free hand slashed at his wrist with its claws in an attempt to loosen him from it. The beast crouched down low, angling its body forwards before it kicked back, taking both itself and Goff off their feet before slamming into the ground alongside the giant. The two continued their wrestling match until the beast ripped its arm free of Goff's hold. Goff snapped his head to the side to avoid the blue blade from skewering his face. The beast used the opportunity to slam the back of its head into the giant's helmet, denting it inwards slightly. Goff released a grunt of pain as the beast ripped itself free of his hold, twirling around and pulling the sword from the around, holding it above its head before bringing it down. The bastard sword of the ashen copy struck the beast in the wrist, releasing a howl of pain. Its blow went wide, slicing into Goff's shoulder instead of his neck. Goff roared in agony before pulling his uninjured arm and slamming it into the neck of the beast. The moonlight greatsword was violently pulled out of his shoulder with a sickening squelch as he rolled over, grasping it and heaving. The sword buried in the beast's wrist vanished, soon reappearing in the ashen copy as it rushed towards them. The beast swapped hands, grabbing the sword with its uninjured arm and swinging it towards the clone, slicing the copy in half in a single swift movement and causing it to crumble into dust. The back of Goff's forearm smashed into the side of its head, snapping it to the side and knocking a dozen teeth out of its jaw, violently breaking bone and making it look more disfigured than before. His free hand went back to his wound as he stumbled back, the beast growling in pain as it glared at the knight. A single burst of lightning struck it in the side. It hissed as its head snapped in the direction of the attack. Solaire lowered his talisman back onto his waist and then withdrew his sword. Lucian lowered his saw cleaver into the ground, soon disappearing into mist before his hand clasped a handle of a weapon which seemed to emerge from the same mist. Pulling it upwards to reveal a large stone-like hammer which he slung over one shoulder. "This is no state for you, Ludwig." Lucian grumbled. "Not again anyway." The named Ludwig focused on him, its broken jaw snapped back to its rightful place in a crunch. The wounds it had suffered slowly healing over as its blade glowed ominously. Master Group Pav. Ash stood at the door to the forum, the large wooden entrance remained tightly closed. He shook his head, turning to Ritska. "Looks like it's been enchanted. We'll need some time to get it." "Berserker." Olga cut him off. "Open it." Ash blinked in surprise but quickly stepped aside when the Dragon Slayer armor marched forwards, slamming its axe into the ground and slinging its shield onto its back. Holding both hands forwards, it began to push the doors, its legs buckling and the tiled ground beneath its feet shattering as it applied more strength. Ash backed away as the creaking of wood grew louder. With a final groan from the berserker, the doors shattered inwards, sending splinters of wood shooting into the interior. "That works." Ash shrugged, turning to Ritska. "I believe we can." He paused, staring at them. "Is something wrong?" The entire group was gagging. Ritska hunched over with both his hands clasped over his mouth as his eyes began to water. The first thing to assault them when they opened the door was the smell. The eye-watering smell could not possibly be put into words to accurately describe it. Olga turned away, moving back down the stairs and holding her hair back started to vomit, a response almost shared by Ritska and Mash. Ah! Ash blinked in realization. Yes, his dulled senses began to take account of it. He cringed. I suppose it is rather foul. I would rather you not dally too long. A voice echoed from within. The group paused and slowly turned back to the entrance. It is rather rude to break into one's dwelling. Have the courtesy to at least face me like the rats you are. Rats. Nero growled, pinching her nose shut. I shall show this degenerate a rat. Ash flicked his blade so it was soon covered with fire, ignoring the squawk of surprise from Gwyndolin at seeing the ominous black flames clinging to his blade. He advanced inwards. The squelching sound had him look down to see the black sludge clinging to his boots. He grimaced behind his helmet as he pulled his foot upwards and saw the broken bone he had stood on. Come, come. The voice called out again, a strange echo to it which sounded as though two different voices were speaking at the same time. Don't be so shy. I dare say I am already familiar with two of you. It is like meeting old friends for dinner, is it not? The final meal of a dead man. Ash called back, advancing inwards. The other servants soon followed him in. Unkindled. The voice replied in greetings, and Gwyndolin. My old meal. How have you been enjoying this second life? I see you look far healthier than last time. It shall make the taste all the more succulent, I suspect. Thee should beware thine own poisonous tongue. Gwyndolin replied with a snarl. Should thee fail to control its flapping, thou may find it cut off. Ah, still some bit in you, how delectable. There was an amused chuckle. And who else have we here? The others soon stepped into the darkened room. Let us see. Ah. Fujimaru Ritska, the last true master of Chaldea. Mash Kyrilite, a fanciful experiment, and little Olga Marie Animosphere, the not quite good enough child. How do you know that? Ritska asked, narrowing his eyes as he covered his nose. The voice tutted in response. That's no way to speak to your betters, young man. An amused sigh soon followed as the room seemed to churn. The sludge along the floor rippled as a figure soon emerged. As for how I know, from beneath the sludge, a green overcoat and ruined top hat appeared, the mocking face cocked into a smile. A friend of yours was kind enough to inform me. Lev. Ritska recoiled. What? How? Lev. Olga started, trembling. What? Ah, hello little Olga. Lev smiled at the woman as more emerged. Only his top half consisted of the professor as it emerged from the ground. The disgusting pillar of flesh and bone snaked upwards until it was looming over them. Yes, you look just as his memories described. You consumed him. Aldrich surmised. Well, in truth it was more than that. Suffice to see we merged into something far greater. Spreading his arms wide, Aldrich grinned down at them, the servants assuming a formation in front of him. Mash and Vrindari taking up defensive positions in front of the masters, Nero and Beatrice. Arash and Gwyndolin behind them while Ash, Gareth, Sif and the Dragon Slayer armor took up the flanks, all staring at him. I don't suppose you could have waited a few more minutes. I was almost complete. Aldrich sighed. It is most vexing to be interrupted twice by the same piece of scum. His eyes narrowed at Ash. This is your second offense. You say that as if I am supposed to feel guilty. Ash scoffed, pointing his sword at the Lord, and opening a doorway into the abyss is nothing to strive for. Is it not? Aldrich shrugged. The deep is merely a tool to be used. It had merely gone too long without capable hands to mold it into something perfect. And that's you? Questioned Ritska. Aldrich's eyes fell on him, causing him to shiver. But of course. As one who could devour gods and demons alike, who else is better suited? Sneering down at them, he soon began chuckling. What is with that expression, little Olga? Are you not pleased to see your old friend? What did you do to him? Olga screamed at him, her face contorted in shock and horror. Aldrich blinked at her, tilting his head in confusion. Were you hoping to kill him yourself? It would have been quite impossible, I'm afraid. He shrugged. he would have simply killed you all quite handily. Ash narrowed his eyes. So he was a demon then. Was. Aldrich replied, now I am. He then flinched, his smug expression flattening out. He still kicks now and then. So he wasn't possessed. Olga whimpered. Aldrich's predatory expression returned. Oh, you truly are as blind as his memories detailed. The poor little girl who could achieve nothing noteworthy. Who was never good enough, so pathetic. I admit, when I saw some of the memories of Flauros, I was concerned that a true sorcerer would come to fight me. I had seen so many competent magi that I believed I would need to be more careful. However, little Olga. Aldrich's smile turned kind, almost caring in the same way a father would smile at their child. Olga's breath hitched, seeing the same caring smile Lev had given her so often. You are no Krishtaria Wodime. Olga's eyes glazed over, her arms fell limply at her side. Mash froze on the spot, then snarled at the saint. No, she is not this Wodime. Ash spoke out, drawing their attention towards him. Nor is she Fujimaru Ritsuka, nor is she Mash Kyrielite. Olga's head slowly turned to him, her brows slightly furrowed. I know nothing of her skill as a sorcerer, nor is her quality as a summoner. All I know is that she is Lady Animosphere. Despite whatever you may claim she is not, I shall tell you what she is. Human. If she, as a mere human, could stand before a Lord of Cinder who could consume gods themselves, is it any wonder you would resort to such petty insults? Cracking a grin behind his helmet, Ash stared up at Aldrich, because perhaps you are merely afraid of those with courage. It would explain why you could only best Gwyndolin after he had been betrayed and poisoned. Aldrich remained silent as he stared down at Ash for a few moments before shrugging his shoulders. Quite the rousing speech, but being told by the worthless that you have worth is hardly a compliment to boast of. Perhaps. Ash admitted, but you were slain by this worthless unkindled. What does that say about you? Quote. Thee should have heeded my advice, devourer. Thy tongue did indeed flap too loudly. Gwyndolin carried on, a venomous tone in his mocking statement. Olga sniffled, rubbing her eyes before leveling a cold glare at Aldrich. Fujimaru. Mash. She brought the pair's attention to them. Defeat Aldrich and restore this era. Nero strode forwards, pointing her burning sword at Aldrich. You shall pay for harming my Rome, creature. Aldrich stared at her for several seconds before he tilted his head to the side. Who are you again? Nero almost facefaulted, gaping openly at Aldrich. I'm Nero Augustus Germanicus. The Emperor of Rome. Really? I thought you some common whore who just happened to be accompanying them. Nero remained silent for several seconds before she growled. I will see to it you shall never torment my Rome again, fiend. I suppose the time for talking is over then. Aldrich shrugged, although I suppose I should introduce myself properly. A small section of the sludge in the corner of the room began to bubble violently. Vrindari turned his head to it in confusion. Then a beam of red energy shot towards him, barely having enough time to avoid it so he wasn't cut in half. Arg. Although he was not fast enough to avoid it entirely, the beam of light slicing through his silver armor with ease, the heavy clank of his sword arm falling to the ground soon followed. Ritsuka recoiled in horror, then stared at the spot where the blast had come from. A large red eye stared at him from the ground, the cross-shaped pupil narrowed at him. I am Aldrich and I am Flauros. Aldrich rose up, the flesh along his meat-like torso split open as more of the red eyes emerged, fizzling with power as they stared at them. I am Aldrich. Devourer of demon gods. He threw his arms wide as a grin formed on his face. The ground around them began to rumble as tentacles comprised of meat burst through the floor. The group retreated as each of them held the same glowing inhuman eyes lining their bodies. Now then, Chaldea. You shall witness my ascension. And, yep, a really long chapter this time. Longest one to date. Yep, Aldrich did consume Flauros and gain access to some of his powers. Meaning this is part 1 of 2 of the finale of this singularity because otherwise the chapter would have probably been 20k words long. So here you go.